Did you know that one of the oldest rivalries in collegiate sports is associated with one of the worst accidents in U.S. sporting history? And it all happened on Thanksgiving Day. In 1892, the University of California, Berkeley and the Stanford University football teams began a tradition that soon became known as the Big Game.
It's more than just a football game. It's the moment to claim bragging rights, to own the territory.
While the University of California had been playing football since 1886, Stanford University's team was still brand new. UC Berkeley initially proposed a Thanksgiving match, but Stanford captain John Whittemore delayed the game till spring in order to give his team some time to practice. Good thing, because he was the only player on Stanford's team who'd even played football before. He was quickly made captain, but the team still didn't have a coach or a football to practice with when they first got together. Nevertheless, on March 19, 1892, Stanford won their first game against UC Berkeley 14-10, effectively beginning one of the oldest sports rivalries in the United States. The games were held annually, often around Thanksgiving, and traditions developed around the event. Before long, it became the top sporting event in San Francisco.
It's not your arm or your leg or your life or your wife or anything like that. It's much more important.
Future President Herbert Hoover, a Stanford student, actually managed the football team and was involved in the planning of the very first big game in 1892. He helped rent the football fields, printed tickets, and collected cash admissions. Within 5 years, the big game had become so popular that grandstands were constructed to hold up to 10,000 spectators. But during the Thanksgiving Day game in 1897, the stands weren't enough to hold the thousands of fans clamoring over one another to see the field. And as the crowd swelled, it became clear that disaster was right around the corner.
For hours before the game, there was a steady procession to the grounds. All sorts of vehicles were pressed into service.
J.C. Weir, one of the contractors who built the stands, watched in horror as over 15,000 people squeezed into the seats while dozens more climbed onto the overhanging roof. Weir knew that the roofs were built only to keep off the rain, and that the stands weren't strong enough to hold that many people. No one listened to his warnings. Hundreds of boys continued to climb up and watch from the grandstand roofs. During the final seconds of the game, the roof broke under their weight, sending people crashing down. Many spectators ended up unconscious and bleeding under the broken beams, but remarkably, only one 10-year-old boy was hurt badly enough to warrant a trip to the hospital. One witness claimed that many people were not killed or maimed for life is simply miraculous. But the lessons of that day went unheeded. At the turn of the 20th century, many American sporting events took place in industrial areas where large plots of land were available and affordable. Arenas were often quickly constructed in between active factories and warehouses, and the grandstands were built to be temporary as sporting events hopped around town like a traveling circus. The 1900 Big Game was to take place just across from the San Francisco and Pacific Glass Works. The Glass Works was scheduled to be open for business on Monday, December 3rd, and in preparation, the east furnace had begun burning for over a week to reach 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. As a result of the 1897 accident, those in charge of constructing the grandstand were on guard against similar incidents. Knowing that the 4-story factory rooftop would be prime seating for those unable to get a ticket, the factory was asked to keep people off the roof in order to avoid another accident. To get Glass Works Superintendent James Davis on board with the plan, he was given 6 tickets to the game. On Thanksgiving Day, November 29, 1900, the Stanford and UC Berkeley football teams prepared to meet on the field as fans began filling the stands around 10:30 in the morning. Thousands of people filed into the stands, but there were plenty of fans who didn't or couldn't pay $1 for a ticket, equivalent to about $36.50 today. They were scrambling to find a place from which to watch the big game. One student, 11-year-old Herman Gehring, tried to sneak in under a fence before being chased away. He then tried to climb a water tower to be able to see the field. But unable to get a good view, he climbed down and joined the fans climbing their way onto the Glassworks building. People were able to get into the factory grounds by digging under the wooden fences and then opening the gates to the outside. Factory management also claimed that some fences were broken down. By kickoff time at 2:30, the Glassworks factory roof was densely covered with between 500 to 1,000 people. Although Superintendent James Davis had been informed of the risk, the crowd was too large for Davis and his workers to control. There were conflicting reports as to whether or not the watchmen hired to keep people off the roof took payment for access instead.
Let's talk about your price.
Factory workers ran through the streets looking for a police officer to help get the crowd off the roof, but they couldn't find anyone. The factory was built to withstand only 40 pounds per square inch. Spectator Herman Gehring later recounted that it was like trying to turn back the waves at the beach. The kids kept pouring through the fence, anxious to see the kickoff. And while trying to get a view, some of the crowd ended up standing on top of the ventilator directly above the 30 by 60 foot, 3,000 degree Fahrenheit furnace in the factory underneath. Although some realized that it was a precarious situation, the throngs of people caged them in, preventing any sort of escape. One man recalled, "All of us were laughing and jesting, and some of the fellows said, if this thing breaks, we'll all go down together." Within 20 minutes of gameplay, tragedy struck. The roof bearing up to 1,000 people collapsed and broke into the factory, bringing scores of people down with it. Spectator Percy Fuller remembered, "We could see a Berkeley player kicking the ball and all moved to watch him closely. Then the roof sprung like a gallows trap. Some people were able to grab onto something at the last second and hold on, but many fell to their deaths." Fuller recalled, "I turned to the building's interior and saw a writhing, yelling mass of humanity struggling to get out of a veritable hell." Oven worker Charles Yachts was one of the first to realize what was happening as people rained down on him while he raked the furnace fire. Some people landed on top of the furnace, which was about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. And while Yachts tried to push them off of the giant poker, another oven worker, Clarence Jeter, frantically turned off the oil feeding the furnace's fire. Jeter later stated, "It was a horrible experience standing there beside a hell pot and seeing human beings roast to death. We did the best we could." It's estimated that nearly 200 people fell through the roof of the glassworks factory, and between 60 and 100 of them fell directly onto the furnace. Many who fell were young men and boys, some of whom were as young as 9 years old. If the people falling from the roof had fallen directly into an open furnace, they would have died instantly. But instead, the falling spectators found themselves cooking alive on the 500-degree Fahrenheit furnace top as broken fuel pipes sprayed boiling oil onto them. Some were unable to move due to their broken bones, and while many who landed on the furnace were ultimately rescued, a 10-year-old boy was unable to be saved. Yachts and Jeter managed to rescue dozens of people, although due to the frantic nature of the situation, they tossed people off the furnace as quickly as they could, which meant paying little attention to the victims' wounds and broken bones. And for those out of arm's reach, metal poles were used to drag people off, sometimes even by hooking into victims' flesh. When rescuers arrived, they were taken aback by the mass calamity. A fireman who was there that day said, "The sight was awful. We knew not which way to turn or what to do." When the roof caved in, there was a tremendous crash. Gameplay stopped for a moment as everyone looked for the source of the sound. According to one account, a UC Berkeley fan yelled, "It's a job," believing the sound was a diversion from Stanford. So with no idea what had happened, the game continued. Unfortunately, as the game resumed, the cacophony of cheers and bands drowned out the screams of the victims. Spectators in the highest bleachers had a sense that a bad accident had occurred because they could see ambulances rushing to the scene. Meanwhile, police and attendants went through the stands during the game asking if anyone in the crowd was a doctor. Despite this, the game carried on, and few were aware of the waking nightmare that was taking place next door. When the game ended with a Stanford victory, fans swept onto the field and paraded the star players down Market Street to the Palace Hotel. While Stanford fans celebrated a Thanksgiving Day victory, others in the city were in the midst of a medical emergency. Dozens of people were taken to hospitals, and thousands more followed them there, hoping for news of their loved ones. Because of the mass of people gathered at the Southern Pacific Hospital, police barricaded the doors to keep the crowd outside. The San Francisco Call reported little boys in knee breeches were laid on the floor all along the length of the hall, some writhing with pains and calling for father and mother. Meanwhile, bodies were delivered to the morgue on fragments of the destroyed roof as the supply of stretchers ran thin. Some of the bodies were so disfigured that their families were only able to identify them through their socks. Victims of the catastrophe were between the ages of 9 and 46, but many of them were boys and young men. 13 people died the same day, but within 4 days, the death toll had risen to 22, with over 100 others being injured. Many ended up with injuries that affected them for the rest of their lives. One of the final victims, Thomas Pedler, lived for 3 years and endured spinal surgery, paralysis, and amputation before dying in 1903. After the tragedy, the city of San Francisco was in a state of shock and mourning. Over the following weekend, there were funerals, with some even running back to back. The San Francisco Call wrote, "It was perhaps the most horrifying accident that ever happened in San Francisco." But at the same time, many who reported on the disaster wasted no time in switching to game coverage. And neither the student newspaper at Stanford nor the one at UC Berkeley mentioned the tragedy at all. Months later, the Stanford yearbook referred to their victory that day as, quote, "the most ecstatic moment of the year to the lover of athletics."
There are a lot of rivalries, but there's nothing to match the big game.
Despite the fact that the Glassworks roof collapse during the 1900 big game was the worst accident at a U.S. sports event to this very day, the disaster seemed to immediately fade from a city's memory. A grand jury was convened, but the proceedings were conducted like a show trial. Ultimately, the grand jury placed all of the blame on the people who climbed onto the roof to watch the game, ruling the deceased had no business being there. No one could be held responsible for their deaths other than themselves. Only a single physical memorial of the tragedy exists in the form of a small stone cross in Holy Cross Cemetery marking the grave of a 12-year-old who died in the catastrophe. Neither the stadium nor the Glassworks factory remains, and even that day's game is all but forgotten. While other 19th century big games have commemorative statues, the 1900 big game doesn't. Even in local history books, there's barely a footnote about the 1900 tragedy.